So Joe Rogan, we all know who Joe Rogan is. He's basically a copycat version of me. Just kidding. I love the Joe Rogan show. I used to not listen to it. When I first started doing podcasts, I was obviously well aware of Joe Rogan's show. For some reason, I just had never listened to it. I started to listen to it probably about 2.5 years ago, and I really do enjoy it. He has a great podcast. I don't need to obviously advertise to his podcast, but he has a fantastic podcast, and he kind of created this whole lifestyle. He kind of created this whole generation of people who kind of live the way that he's kind of living and his mindset or whatever. Well, he's been paid big time for this. Spotify has reached a deal with him to bring his podcast over to Spotify. Now, as I understand it, it will be exclusive to Spotify, but he will still put the video clips on YouTube how he does now. So I think there's still going to be both. But as far as the podcast, it will be exclusive to Spotify. And the deal is upwards of $100 million. It's more than likely, if I had to guess, they made two different deals. They made a deal for the historic catalog, and then they made a deal for his deal. So it's probably something to the tune of, hey, we'll give you $100 million for the Joe Rogan Experience. We'll pay you $50 million a year, and then you have bonuses for downloads or something. So he's probably, this deal more than likely is probably one of those deals where he's looking at $100 million a year, somewhere in that Rush Limbaugh, Howard Stern universe. And it's really interesting to see this kind of keep happening because, not to toot my own horn, but I basically told everyone years ago, and I even hinted at it on the Q&A podcast when I talked about when I was moving away from the newspaper. It's because I really believed in the independent creator, and I thought that was going to be the future of radio, TV, and everything else. And it wasn't. It honestly was way before that. You can look at Howard Stern, you can look at Rush Limbaugh, you can look at Glenn Beck, you can look at Alex Jones, you can look at Bill Simmons. Those are some people who just immediately come to mind. All those people either got fired or were never hired by a normal TV station, terrestrial radio station, newspaper, magazine, whatever, and they just branched out on their own and took over, and completely took over. And I mean, Bill Simmons just made a huge deal for his podcast and for Grantland and all that stuff. We've seen it a bunch of times. Howard Stern, obviously, when he went to Sirius, started satellite radio. Rush Limbaugh is his own planet. That is the future. And it may be hard to understand if you're not in that world. Now, if you're listening to this, you're obviously in that world. You obviously understand the power of digital media and the independent content creator. If you're here, if you're listening to this podcast, you get it. Now, if you're still watching the 6 o'clock news, if you're still doing that, you probably haven't moved over yet. But something like Barstool Sports is, in my opinion, bigger and a more powerful brand than something like ESPN, which 10 years ago, it would have been absolutely ridiculous to even think about the idea of another sports entity rivaling ESPN. You look at Fox Sports. Fox Sports does a good job, but Fox Sports ain't ESPN. Fox Sports sure as hell is in Barstool Sports. I mean, if you looked at traffic, if you looked at numbers, listens, stuff like that, Barstool's programming is destroying Fox Sports or ESPN. And that's what these companies are starting to believe. That's what these companies are starting to understand. Is that, man, why would I pay, I'm just going to pick a random thing. Why would I pay Stephen A. Smith and Max Kellerman this much money, have producers, a studio, cameramen, a whole team of writers, researchers, all this stuff? Why would I do that when I can find a podcast guy or I can find a content creator who's already creating the content? He's already writing it, or she. They're already producing it. Now I just have to get it and just move it here, and it's done. These teams are so much smaller now. I mean, this is something, for example, all right, let's say this podcast started to do more, like, numbers wise or whatever, than like a terrestrial radio station in the area. So let's say we were doing better numbers than them. If you're that radio station, you're looking at, so I employ these people, I pay them a salary, I own the equipment, I'm doing all this stuff. We have multiple people, multiple shifts, and then this one person. So it's just me. So what do? I have all the equipment, I write the show, I do the show, I edit the show, I publish the show, I market the show, I make every decision on the show. Like, every single aspect of this is the creator versus some huge team. And it started moving that way with the Howard Sterns or whoever, and it has not stopped. I mean, Bill Simmons, basically what Bill Simmons said was, I can do the entirety of ESPN's job. I can write, edit, produce, hire, podcast. I can do it all. I don't need everyone at ESPN. And Bill Simmons 100% bet on himself, and he 100% was correct. Joe Rogan was never in that position where like the Bill Simmons were or the Glenn Becks, where Joe Rogan wasn't part of MSNBC and then broke off. He wasn't part of some other station or some other thing and broke off. He started this on his own. So Joe is another pioneer. He's like the Howard Stern of podcasts, basically, where he's giving some real power to the podcaster. This is the time for you to be in podcasting. This is the time for you to be in content creation. If you have ever thought about content creation, if you've ever thought like, man, I would love to have a TV show. I'd love to have a radio show. I'd love to be an anchor for a news show. Now, the way to go about that is to go and do it. It's not to go to college or to go get a job there. It's do it. Do it. If you want to be on the radio, do a podcast and market it and research and write and do it and get good at it. And if you can get it big enough, you will be rewarded. There's no doubt about that. It's like that with everything. I mean, for example, a news show. If I said I want to be a newscaster or a news anchor or whatever, I would just set up a news station in the studio and I would start to do a YouTube news show, or a news show on YouTube, not a news show about YouTube. I would start to do a news show on YouTube, and I would just try and push that to the limit to where then I could parlay that into the job I wanted. I mean, this space, this content creator space, we're going to take a quick break here. We're going to take a quick break and reset the DSLR, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about this some more. This is a subject I'm very passionate about. We have a lot more to talk about, so we got to get moving. Joe Rogan's deal, I mean, you're talking about, I think podcasts, and Barstool Sports, or Dave Portnoy with Barstool Sports talked about this. Even he didn't realize how simple of a generator podcasts are. And I think podcasts are going to be the next big boom. They say, like, what is it, TV ruined the radio star or whatever? I think podcasts are going to ruin the video star. And you already see that. A few people, Logan Paul, H3H3, these were huge video creators who moved to a podcast, who now all they really do is a podcast because they realized it's so hard to make a good video. You have to video, you have to edit it probably takes money, takes time, takes resources. A podcast, you sit down, you talk about it, you talk about whatever subjects, it's usually unedited, usually heavily unedited, and people can ingest it very simply. They ingest it on their phones, they ingest it, just listening on a run or on a walk. I know people who listen to this podcast. They listen to this podcast on the treadmill. I've had multiple people tell me, I listen to your show while I'm at the gym or while I'm running on the treadmill. And they can't, it's so easy to ingest, and it's so easy for me to do. I mean, if you go back and look at some of my other videos, some of our heavily edited videos, that takes days of editing. That takes hours and hours of recording, hours and hours of takes. This, if we do an hour and 20-minute podcast, more than likely, it'll take me an hour and 20 minutes to do the podcast. It'll take me 35 minutes maybe to edit it, and another 15 minutes to publish it. We're done. Resources, zero. Once we have the equipment, done. And then, obviously I'm not talking about my podcast, but then revenue just comes in, your sponsors there. So for these huge creators, podcasts are the way to go. Podcasts are the future. And you're seeing it so much with podcasts just popping up out of nowhere. If you have a following at all, if you're a celebrity or an athlete or whatever, you not having a podcast is foolish, to be honest. Because it's just a guaranteed way to be relevant, a guaranteed way to get yourself out there. And then you do what we do, and you chop up the clips onto YouTube. So now, and this is what the Logan Pauls and the H3H3s and Joe Rogan and all those people, Tim Dillon, Theo Vaughn, Chris D'Elia, they take their podcast, they cut it up, they film it, and they put that on YouTube. Those are not heavily edited videos because the podcast already happened. Usually they're not edited at all because you want it to be a free-flowing conversation. So now you have a successful podcast, a successful YouTube channel, and it's just all from the same thing. It's all from the same component. So Joe Rogan has opened this door with this deal. And I know at the beginning of the episode we said sorry for promising something and not doing it, or teasing something and not doing it, but I do have a video in the chamber, or a video that I'm working on, that really goes into kind of the state of media right now. Goes into Twitch, goes into YouTube, goes into podcasting, because we're seeing so much of it right now. We're seeing celebrities on Twitch. We're seeing celebrities or whatever moving to this universe. And content creation is the independent content creation is the new place to be. This is the new blog. So, 10 years ago, blogs were all the rage. Everyone had a blog, right? That's not how it is anymore. Now, it's some combination of podcast, YouTube channel, social media, whatever. And it's your brand. That's the new big boom. And I've been doing this for 8 years. So I've seen this coming for a long time. But we're about to hit the huge explosion where it's really about to take over. So I'm going to have a video out this week, guaranteed 100%, undoubtedly, that really goes into YouTube, Twitch, and all that stuff. We may separate it. I got to do the video first, but we may separate, explaining Twitch, explaining YouTube, explaining podcasting, or all in one bubble. So we'll figure that out. But yeah, Joe Rogan's deal, insane for the podcasting universe.